Well, with me now is Janet Yale, the chair of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel. Janet Yale, good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me. A lot of people have been waiting to see these recommendations, and in particular, we're going to cover a lot of stuff in our 10 minutes or so together, but how you propose to deal with the web giants such as Netflix and Amazon and Facebook when it comes to taxation and Canadian content. So let's start there. What are you recommending for regulating these web giants, as we call it, and leveling the playing field in Canada in terms of content and production and the contributions they make to this country?
Well, we started from the premise that everybody that benefits from participating in the Canadian system, whether it's in terms of advertising revenues or subscription revenues, has to contribute. And right now, because of the exemption that applies to anything that's delivered online, none of the foreign streaming services or even domestic streaming services make a contribution. So we started from the principle of like for like fairness and the notion that if you benefit from the system, you should contribute. So we've created the way for all of internet-based streaming services to be captured within the broadcasting legislation.
So explain how that will work.
So the first thing is to recognize that we need them to come in under the Act, and we've created a registration regime, a very simple registration requirement that all streaming services would have to do. And we've created 3 categories of service and said, you now, Canadian, foreign, whatever, have to fall within one of the 3 to be relevant: curation, aggregation, and sharing. So if you think of companies like Netflix, they, in our view, are more like CTV than they are like a cable company. They're curators because they acquire, they produce content that they then disseminate to consumers like us. And just like traditional broadcasters, they have spending obligations in our system. They have to invest in the production and discoverability of Canadian content on a percentage to be determined by the CRTC.
Okay. There existing media companies in this country, content producers, you mentioned CTV and others, they're required to pay into funds to create Canadian content and set aside airtime for Canadian content. Would those streaming companies be required to do the same?
So the programming services, generally speaking, don't put money into other funds. Broadcasters will receive money from the Canada Media Fund traditionally. So what we're saying is like for like, just as all of the traditional programming licensees have spending obligations and often exhibition requirements or discoverability requirements, so too would services like Netflix, like Prime TV, and so on. So it's really a like for like. We recognize that the existing broadcasters have a lot of obligations, and we've also recommended that the CRTC look at lightening their load so that on a like for like basis, they would be able to compete effectively with the foreign streaming services.
Well, let's stay with this for just a bit. That was, you hear the complaint from traditional broadcasters, if I can put it that way, in this country, that the field needs to be leveled. Do you think this does it?
We do. We think, well, don't forget, our job was legislative and regulatory reform, not to make the actual policy determinations that would be made by the CRTC.
This provides the framework,
and this is about that legislative framework and giving the CRTC the regulatory tools they need to bring that into effect. We're very conscious. And so, for example, for broadcasters, one of the recommendations we've made is that they should be able to do productions through in-house or affiliated production companies rather than have to go through the Canada Media Fund to contract through license fees with independent producers. So we are trying to recognize that business models are changing and the regulatory framework has to be sufficiently flexible that the various undertakings can grow and thrive and change.
Did you consider a tax on these companies? What we call it would be in effect a consumption tax. I think it would be on subscriptions and so on, and that money collected would then be put into the funds for Canadian content.
Obviously, all options were considered. I think at the end of the day, we felt very importantly that it's important to manage prices to consumers, and so we did not support putting a tax on companies like these foreign streaming services, and we recognize that they spend a lot of money every year in Canada on productions, but the problem with those service productions, which are terrific, they generate jobs, they're good for the economy, but they don't qualify as Canadian content. We're saying a percentage of that program budget that they're spending in Canada has to count as Canadian in the sense that key creative positions must be held by Canadians as an important contribution to Canadian culture.
That's an important distinction, I think, isn't it? I mean, because they make the case that, look, we're doing lots of stuff in Canada, but talk to me a little bit more about the significance of that difference. It's not just that you might produce something in this country. Are you saying that the key people, the key creative people have to be Canadian, but does the content also have to be about Canada?
Well, I mean, I think that'll be, again, for the CRTC to decide. There are Canadian content requirements. The fact that they spend a lot of money in Canada today, taking advantage of the Canadian dollar and the tax credits that exist, is terrific. It's great for the economy. But from a cultural perspective, we want to make sure that there are Canadian stories and Canadian perspectives. And the only way to have that is if the productions meet the Canadian content requirements.
You've used the term a couple of times now, and I want you to elaborate on it for the audience. Discoverability. When you talk about Canadian content and the discoverability of Canadian content, what do you mean?
Well, it's one thing to produce great Canadian content. It's another thing for people to be able to find it. So how do we, in a world of streaming services, non-linear, the catalog is there, ensure that if Netflix has a range of wonderful Canadian content that
we need to know about
that you need to know about it, and so is how prominent do they make it on the home screens? How do they deal with the algorithms so that those choices are included in the ones that are pushed to you? So how do we think about making sure that they promote and ensure that Canadians that want those choices are able to find them? Let's
talk a little bit about the CBC, the National Public Broadcaster. You've got some recommendations for their role too, and one of the things that struck me is you think they can be a more robust check against misinformation in the years ahead. How do you see that happening?
Well, we certainly recognize that today there's a lot of concerns about misinformation and fake news. And so one of the principles that we've articulated in the report is that the best protection against that is accurate, trusted, and reliable sources of news. Mm-hmm. And the role of the public broadcaster as a national media institution in relation to news is one that we think should be expanded so that they can be properly funded to do local, regional, national news, as well as providing a Canadian perspective on international news.
And you say they ought to be able to do it without advertising, like phasing out advertising over a 5-year period, starting in the news divisions at CBC. I think right now they get somewhere a little over $1.1 billion as a parliamentary appropriation. Are you suggesting the CBC needs more money? Get out of advertising, but you need more money from the Parliament of Canada to run it?
We haven't quantified exactly what the parliamentary appropriation should be. What we have said is two things. One is they need stable long-term funding so that they have certainty. Related to that there should be an agreement between CBC Radio-Canada and the government of Canada as to what that mandate should be, and then be resourced to achieve that mandate. And that is certainly a problem right now because we believe they're not really set up to fulfill that national cultural and media and news role. The other thing I would say is that if you look at the OECD countries, CBC Radio-Canada on a dollars per capita basis is at the bottom of the list for national media institutions. So it's hard to say how much money it would take to do a great job, but we think that's a conversation that has to happen between the CBC and the federal government.
Okay, a couple of things if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's and I am. So I like reading this kind of stuff. But you spend a fair bit of time on the whole issue of access and broadband in this country. And sure, successive governments have tried to push it along and tried to get, but there's still lots of the parts of the country where we're not doing very well at that. What does your report say about the need to expand broadband and the role of government in that?
Well, one of the fundamental things we talk about in the report is the user perspective. And we say everyone, no matter where you live in Canada, deserves to have a connected life. Because at this point, broadband connectivity is really a need to do. It's a necessity. It's not a luxury anymore. And so we say where there isn't, where the private sector is not rolling out broadband at a rapid enough pace, the government needs to step in and do that. And so we've called on them to accelerate the rollout of broadband connectivity in rural and remote regions, as well as in Indigenous communities, and to do that by 2030. It's about 10% of the population that isn't well covered today, and the government has committed to doing that by 2030. We're encouraging them to do it faster.
Let's finish on this. I mean, a lot of this report is if I can put it this way, the sort of mechanics and nuts and bolts of legislative bodies, for instance, the CRTC, renaming the CRTC and changing the way it operates, changing its responsibilities. But what I want to get from you to finish, Janet Yale, is if all of these proposals are to be enacted, what is the broadcast and the web universe look like for me as a consumer 5 or 8 years down the road? What was the purpose of this?
I think what we wanted to do was to recognize this is an open global market. Canada is part of an open global marketplace now, and we want to preserve the right of people living in Canada to a free and open internet and have the content they want from wherever they want. And in order to do that, they need broadband connectivity, and they need affordable choices when it comes to their telecommunication services, whether it's wireless or internet. And so we've made a lot of recommendations that are about ensuring that Canadians, or people living in Canada, wherever they live and whoever they are, have affordable, barrier-free access to broadband connectivity so that they can participate fully in the digital economy and have the benefits of all of the services and opportunities and content that are there on offer.
All right, the government says it's planning to move as quickly as it can on these recommendations, and always challenges, I suppose, in a minority parliament. We'll see how far down the road they get. Janet Yale, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.